On March 11, 2026, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran issued a declaration that sent shockwaves through every trading floor, every finance ministry, and every kitchen table on earth. The words were simple, brutal, final. Not a single liter of oil will pass through the Strait of Hormuz. And then came the threat that stopped the world cold. Oil would hit $200 per barrel. Not a warning, not a bluff, a promise, backed by burning ships, drone swarms, and the full military apparatus of a nation that has been preparing for this moment for decades. This is not a geopolitical headline you scroll past. This is the event that changes the price of everything you buy, every bill you pay, and every plan you have made for the next 5 years. You need to understand something before we go any further. 21 million barrels of oil pass through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. That is 20% of all global oil and liquefied natural gas supply on the entire planet, moving through a waterway that, at its narrowest point, is only 21 miles wide. Every supertanker heading from Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Iran itself must thread that needle. There is no pipeline. There is no alternate route that can absorb this volume. The Strait of Hormuz is the jugular vein of the global energy system, and as of March 11, 2026, Iran has its hand wrapped around that vein and is squeezing with the full force of a regime that has decided it has nothing left to lose. This is not the first time the world has faced an oil shock. In 1973, the Arab oil embargo created a crisis that lasted years and introduced the Western world to a new and terrifying economic concept: stagflation, the combination of high inflation, rising unemployment, and stagnant economic growth all at the same time, a combination that traditional economic tools cannot fight because every cure makes another symptom worse. The Federal Reserve of that era was helpless. Governments stumbled. Ordinary people watched their savings evaporate and their purchasing power collapse in real time. We are standing at the threshold of something larger than that, something that makes 1973 look like a trial run. And the institutions that are supposed to protect you are already telling you, in carefully chosen words, that they do not have the tools to handle what is coming. Before we go deeper into what this means for your money, your job, and your family's financial security, if you are not subscribed to this channel, do it right now. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for all notifications. We cover the stories that mainstream financial media buries because the implications are too frightening, too politically inconvenient, or too damaging to market sentiment for the large networks to touch honestly. Every week, we translate what is happening in the corridors of power and on the trading floors into plain language that helps you protect yourself and your family. This video is exactly that kind of story. Subscribe now, because what we are about to walk through will change how you see the global economy permanently. On the morning of March 11, 2026, 3 cargo ships were attacked in the Strait of Hormuz in a coordinated military action. The Thailand-flagged vessel Mayuri Nari was struck and caught fire. 20 crew members had to be evacuated by Oman's Royal Navy in emergency rescue operations conducted under fire risk. 3 crew members remain missing as of this recording. By the end of that same day, 5 vessels total had been attacked across the Gulf. These were not random acts of piracy. This was a message, a kinetic demonstration that the IRGC's declaration was not rhetoric but operational reality, enforced by missiles, drones, and naval forces that have spent years preparing for exactly this confrontation. The insurance markets understood immediately. War risk premiums on Gulf shipping routes exploded overnight. Ship owners began calculating whether any profit margin justifies sending a crew into waters where the flag of your nation means nothing, and the only question is whether the missile finds you first. Now, let us talk about what $200 per barrel of oil actually means for you personally, because this is where the abstraction becomes a direct assault on your household finances. At $200 per barrel, the average American family pays an additional $4,000 per year on fuel costs alone, and that is before the second-order effects cascade through every product you buy. Every item on a grocery store shelf was transported by a truck that runs on diesel. Every piece of clothing you wear crossed an ocean in a container ship that burns bunker fuel. Every prescription medication was manufactured in a facility powered by energy tied to global oil markets. At $200 per barrel, the price of everything rises, not just gasoline at the pump, but food, medicine, clothing, electronics, housing, and every service that requires anyone to travel anywhere to provide it. $4,000 per year in direct fuel costs is just the beginning. The total inflationary impact on a median American household would be multiples of that number once you account for pass-through costs across every sector of the economy simultaneously. And here is what makes this moment uniquely catastrophic compared to previous oil shocks. The Federal Reserve has almost no room to respond. Going into this crisis, the Fed was already frozen. The federal funds rate sits at 3.5% to 3.75%, a level that has already slowed the economy, already strained the commercial real estate sector, and already put enormous pressure on corporate debt loads that were structured for a zero-interest rate world. As of the most recent probability data, there is only a 2.7% chance of a rate cut at the March meeting. Only 2.7%. Federal Reserve governors have been explicit. The war has, quote, won, which in central bank language means they have no idea what to do and are afraid to move in either direction. If they cut rates to fight the economic slowdown caused by the oil shock, they pour gasoline on inflation at a moment when inflation is already being reignited by energy prices. If they raise rates to fight inflation, they accelerate the recession that analysts are already pricing into probability markets. This is the central banker's nightmare scenario. There is no good move. Every option makes something worse. While the Fed deliberates, J.P. Morgan's economists have already run the numbers. If oil stays at current levels, even without reaching $200, just staying in the $85 to $92 range where it trades today, which is already 42% above pre-war levels of about $67, U.S. inflation rises from 2.4% to over 3% by year's end. If oil spikes toward the IRGC's stated target of $200, those projections become catastrophically optimistic by comparison. You are not watching a market correction. You are watching the beginning of a structural repricing of the global economy, one where the anchor assumption that energy will remain affordable is being pulled out from under every financial model, every retirement projection, and every business plan on the planet at the same time. The recession signals are flashing in ways that financial media is underreporting because the implications are deeply uncomfortable for anyone who depends on investor confidence to drive advertising revenue. On Kalshi, the prediction market where sophisticated investors put real money behind probability assessments, recession odds hit 34%, the highest reading since November. 34% is not a tail risk. In probability terms, that is roughly the chance of rain on a partly cloudy day. You would not leave your house without an umbrella at 34%. And prediction markets in this era have consistently been more accurate than institutional forecasts because they aggregate information from thousands of participants who have actual financial skin in the game. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell 289 points in a single session following the IEA's emergency reserve release announcement, which is remarkable because that announcement was supposed to be a calming signal. The market looked at the largest emergency strategic reserve release in human history and decided it was not enough. That reaction tells you everything you need to know about how serious professional money managers believe this situation to be. The global domino sequence has already begun, and you need to follow each falling piece carefully because together they paint a picture that no single headline captures. South Korea's KOSPI index fell 12% in a single trading day on March 4th, triggering a circuit breaker, the market halt mechanism that is only activated during crashes of historic severity. The last time South Korea's market triggered a circuit breaker at this magnitude was 2008. South Korea is one of the world's largest importers of Gulf oil. Its industrial base, its steel mills, its semiconductor fabs, its automobile plants, all of them run on energy that flows through the Strait of Hormuz. A 12% single-day crash in a G20 economy is not a correction. It is a signal that institutional investors are pricing in a structural disruption to that nation's economic model. When South Korea's manufacturing sector contracts, the global supply chains that depend on it, including American technology companies that rely on Korean semiconductors, contract with it in ways that will show up in your devices, your appliances, and your car within months. Pakistan is a story that is receiving almost no coverage in Western financial media, and that absence of coverage is itself a warning sign. Pakistan is a nation of 230 million people. It is a nuclear-armed state, and as of March 11th, it has declared wartime austerity measures of a severity not seen in peacetime economies anywhere in recent memory. A 4-day work week has been imposed across the public sector. Schools have been closed to reduce energy consumption. Legislators have accepted 25% salary cuts, not because they wanted to, but because the government needed to demonstrate visible sacrifice to a population facing fuel rationing. Let that sink in. A nuclear state with a population larger than Brazil is rationing fuel, closing schools, and cutting government salaries because of an oil shock that has not yet reached its worst projected outcome. If this is where Pakistan is in March of 2026, where does it stand in June or September if the Strait of Hormuz remains closed or partially disrupted? The social and political instability of a nuclear-armed nation undergoing this level of economic stress is not just a humanitarian concern, it is a geopolitical risk that creates second and third-order threats that make the oil price problem look manageable by comparison. The International Energy Agency's response to the crisis has been historic in scale and historically insufficient in effect. The IEA coordinated the release of 400 million barrels from strategic petroleum reserves, the largest emergency release in the history of that institution, larger than any response to Hurricane Katrina, the Libyan civil war, or the initial invasion of Ukraine. 400 million barrels sounds like an enormous number. It is an enormous number. And it equals roughly 13 days of global oil consumption. 13 days. The market understood this arithmetic immediately, which is why the Dow fell 289 points on the day of the announcement instead of rallying. Analysts were blunt. The release doesn't solve the other problems. It buys perhaps 2 weeks of psychological cushion before the physical reality of reduced supply reasserts itself on prices with full force. Having deployed 400 million barrels, the emergency buffer is now 400 million barrels smaller than it was before this crisis began. The emergency tool has been partially spent. The emergency is ongoing and escalating. There is one actor in this crisis who is not suffering alongside everyone else, and that actor's behavior reveals a great deal about the true architecture of this conflict. China is continuing to receive Iranian oil through the Strait of Hormuz, even as the war chokes shipping for every other nation. Chinese-flagged vessels, Chinese-backed cargoes, and Chinese-coordinated logistics chains are moving through the same waters where Western-affiliated ships are being attacked and burned. This is not a coincidence. It is a demonstration of the economic warfare dimension of this conflict, a dimension that operates entirely separately from the military one. China has spent years building financial and logistical infrastructure that allows it to access Iranian crude outside the dollar-denominated global financial system. Shadow fleets, alternative payment networks, bilateral agreements settled in yuan rather than dollars. The result is that while Japan, South Korea, India, and the Philippines, nations that collectively receive 80% of all oil that flows through Hormuz, scramble to find alternative supplies at skyrocketing prices, China continues to pump Iranian oil into its refineries at favorable terms. This is economic asymmetric warfare, and China is winning the energy dimension of this conflict decisively, while the shooting war continues around them. Every barrel China secures at below-market prices during this crisis is a barrel of competitive advantage over the economies paying war premiums for the same commodity. Lower input costs mean Chinese manufacturers can undercut competitors on price at the exact moment when their competitors are being squeezed hardest. You need to understand that this war is not just a military confrontation. It is an economic competition being fought through energy markets, and the side that secures its energy supply while the other side scrambles is winning a dimension of that competition that will shape the global economic order for the next decade. The comparison to 1973 is not rhetorical. It is structural and deeply alarming. The Arab oil embargo created a supply shock that reduced global oil availability by roughly 5%, and that 5% reduction was enough to trigger years of stagflation, permanently reshape global energy policy, end the post-war economic expansion, and contribute to the downfall of governments across the developed world. What we are looking at today is a potential disruption to 20% of global supply, 4 times the magnitude of 1973, hitting an economy that already carries far more debt, already has elevated inflation, and already operates with central banks that have spent most of their conventional ammunition. The 1973 crisis produced 10 years of economic pain. The economists who have modeled the current scenario using that baseline are arriving at projections they are reluctant to publish under their own names. When people paid to analyze risk professionally are afraid to attach their names to their own research, that is a signal worth taking seriously. There is a historical pattern in the oil market that has not failed once in 40 years, and it is the pattern that professional investors fear most right now. Every time oil has sustained above $100 to $120 per barrel for a period of months, a recession in the United States has followed within 12 months. Every single time, the 1973 embargo, the 1979 Iranian Revolution, the 1990 Gulf War, the 2008 commodity super spike, each instance translated with remarkable consistency and a lag of 6 to 12 months into economic contraction. The mechanism is straightforward. High energy costs reduce corporate profit margins, which leads to reduced investment and hiring. They reduce consumer disposable income, which leads to reduced spending, and they increase input costs across every industry simultaneously, compressing the economy from both the supply side and demand side at once. Oil spiked to $119.50 per barrel on March 9th, already above the threshold that has historically triggered recession within the following year. Even at $85 to $92 today, 42% above pre-crisis levels, the cumulative drag on economic activity is building every week. The pattern has not failed in 40 years. There is no structural reason to believe it will fail now. The banking system enters this crisis in a condition that should concern you deeply because the oil shock does not arrive in isolation. It lands on top of a financial sector that has been visibly fragile for over a year. Commercial real estate losses are still working their way through regional bank balance sheets. Corporate debt loads from the zero interest rate era of 2020 to 2022 are rolling over into a world where refinancing costs are 3 to 4 times higher. Consumer credit card delinquencies were already at multi-decade highs before the oil shock began. None of these problems were solved before the crisis struck. They were managed, contained, monitored, but not resolved. An oil shock of this magnitude arriving on top of these pre-existing fault lines does not just slow the economy. It triggers the credit events that the pre-existing fragility was already moving toward, just faster and harder than would otherwise have occurred. The financial system does not need the oil shock to cause a crisis from a standing start. It needs only the final push that sends already stressed institutions past the point of stability. And that is how financial crises actually happen, not from a single cause, but from compounding vulnerabilities arriving in sequence until the system can no longer absorb each successive blow. What is happening in global oil markets goes beyond the immediate crisis of the Strait. It is a direct attack on the architecture of the petrodollar system, the arrangement established in the 1970s under which global oil trade is conducted in U.S. dollars, creating permanent demand for dollar-denominated assets and giving the United States an extraordinary structural advantage in the global financial order. When Iran disrupts Hormuz shipping for Western and Asian nations while China continues to receive oil in yuan-settled transactions, it demonstrates in real time that oil trade can be routed around the dollar system entirely. Every nation that watches China navigate this crisis smoothly while dollar-aligned nations suffer is receiving a lesson about the true costs of dollar alignment that no diplomatic messaging can counteract. Saudi Arabia has been expanding its yuan swap lines with China since 2022. Brazil and Russia settled energy transactions in non-dollar currencies throughout 2023 and 24. The current crisis does not create the de-dollarization trend. It accelerates it at a moment when the vulnerability of dollar-aligned nations is on full global display. Here is what governments are not telling you about this crisis, not because they are malicious, but because telling you the full picture would trigger the panic they are desperately trying to prevent. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve release is the last major card most Western governments had in their hand. Having played it, they are now dependent on negotiated de-escalation, a diplomatic outcome that requires Iran to accept terms it has shown no willingness to accept. The Qatar LNG force majeure is not a short-term disruption. Qatar supplies 20% of global liquefied natural gas. The fuel that heats European homes in winter powers Asian industrial facilities and serves as the marginal energy source for dozens of nations that have no domestic production. European gas prices surged over 70% since this conflict began. The U.S. launched a $20 billion war insurance plan through Chubb and the Development Finance Corporation to keep ships moving, a plan that underscores both the urgency of the problem and the fundamental limitation of the solution, because insurance does not make missiles miss. No premium makes a captain willing to sail his crew into a combat zone where the attacking nation has stated all shipping is a legitimate target. What governments are telling you is that the situation is being managed. What the evidence shows is that management tools have been partially exhausted, the diplomatic path to resolution is unclear, and the economic damage is compounding every day. The strait remains dangerous. So what do you actually do with all of this? Let us talk practically, because this channel is not about fear for its own sake. It is about preparation, and there is a meaningful difference. The first thing you need to understand is that the time to act is now, not when headlines confirm what the data is already showing. By the time a crisis is obvious to everyone, the protective moves have already been priced out of reach. Energy exposure is not optional in this environment. It is a necessary hedge for anyone who holds a portfolio in currencies being inflated by rising energy costs. Commodities broadly, energy producers specifically, And physical assets tend to appreciate in inflationary shocks driven by supply constraints. Cash in savings accounts, paying 2 to 3%, loses purchasing power in real time when inflation is being pushed above that threshold by oil market dynamics that are structural, not transitory. This is not financial advice. This is the historically documented behavior of asset classes during oil-driven inflationary periods going back over 50 years across multiple continents. Consult a qualified financial advisor for decisions specific to your situation. Debt is your enemy in this environment. Variable rate debt reprices against you when central banks are eventually forced to raise rates to fight inflation. They have no other tools to combat. The families who survived the stagflation of the late 1970s and early 1980s, financially intact, were overwhelmingly those who had minimized variable rate debt exposure before the crisis deepened. And the most uncomfortable truth of all, supply chain disruptions of this magnitude do not resolve in weeks. They resolve in months or years. The Strait of Hormuz will not reopen overnight. The Qatar LNG force majeure will not lift on a convenient schedule. The prudent response is to think carefully about your household's resilience, not in apocalyptic terms, but in the practical terms that anyone who has lived through a serious disruption already understands. You plan ahead. You reduce unnecessary exposure. You position yourself to absorb shocks rather than be destroyed by them. The world changed on March 11, 2026, in ways that will take years to fully price into every market. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a shipping lane. It is the central nervous system of the global economy's energy supply, and Iran has demonstrated both the willingness and the capability to shut it down. The burning ships are real. The missing crew members are real. The spike in oil prices is real. The frozen Federal Reserve is real. The crashing stock markets from Seoul to London are real. Pakistan's austerity is real. The IEA's partially exhausted reserves are real. The China angle is real. The recession probability is real. None of this is prediction or speculation. These are documented facts as of the date of this video. The question is not whether the crisis is serious. The question is how long it lasts, how deep it goes, and whether you are positioned to navigate it, or whether you are one of the millions who will look back in 2 years and say, they saw all the signs and did not act in time. That is the only question that matters now. If this video gave you clarity on a story you were not getting from mainstream sources, there are 3 things you can do right now. First, subscribe to this channel. We will be tracking every development in this crisis as it unfolds, and you need to be here for those updates. Second, share this video with someone who has money to protect, a family to provide for, or a business that depends on energy costs staying manageable. They need this information whether they realize it yet or not. Third, leave a comment below telling us where you are in the world and how this crisis is affecting your daily costs. We read every comment, and the ground-level data our audience provides helps us understand what is happening before it shows up in official statistics. In our next video, we will break down the specific financial instruments and asset allocation strategies that have historically performed during oil-driven stagflation. The playbook from the 1970s, updated for the modern financial system. You do not want to miss that one. Subscribe now, share this video. The information is free. The cost of not having it is not.